Okay, thanks very much, Dan. Just to prove that we're live, thank you also to Tommy and Jonathan. Brains fried, so yeah, definitely live. Another thing that's fried is my PC, so if I disappear, it's because my fan is going completely nuts under the desk here, and it may just conk out. Anyway, another thing that proves we're live is that Dan has made a mistake in his introduction, which I'll correct in about 30 seconds, so never mind. See if anybody spots what it is. So here I am to talk about using Spring with OpenAPI. It's a version of a talk that I gave at Spring 1 in Las Vegas a couple of months ago. So if you were there, you can probably wander off for the next half an hour or so, but come back again because there are some updates and there's some new stuff in here as well. So that's me. If anybody doesn't know about me, I've been on the Spring team for like forever. And currently I'm kind of, I don't know, they call me the mad scientist, so I try stuff out. And one of the things I've been playing with recently is OpenAPI, so that's what I'm going to talk to you about today. And there is there's actually more than one GitHub repo. You'll see a couple of links as we go through, and there's a slide at the end as well. I don't have the fancy what do you call them? Things that you scan, barcodes that the Tommy and Jonathan had. So I'm just low tech, or maybe 1990s, whatever. So I'm going to talk about what is OpenAPI, and that's where I'll get a chance to correct Dan. Who's using it? In what kind of ways do they use it? I've seen a couple of patterns in my travels around the customers who I've been talking to. And how would you do it if you were using Spring? That's what I want to talk about. And so here's the mistake I think Dan made. I think I heard him say OpenAI, but that's not what this is about. So there is not going to be any ChatGPT, large language models, prompt engineering, none of that. It's all about APIs. It's all about HTTP and JSON, roughly speaking. So you probably know what OpenAPI is, right? Because as we'll find out, as we go on a bit further, we'll find out that actually quite a lot of people are using it already and also using it with Spring. But here's a refresher, and just to get us all on the same page. So OpenAPI used to be called Swagger, and then it became so popular that they decided to kind of make it a bit more, I don't know, official. It's more of a sort of spec-based project now than just an implementation, which is where it started. And the idea is that you take an HTTP API and you represent it in a JSON document like the one that you're looking at on the screen here. So this one says it's from OpenAPI version 3, so that you can call that Swagger version 3 as well. It used to be called Swagger and it was version 2. And it's got some metadata, so it says here's the information about the API. If you want to know about it, call me. Here's my URL. This is the version for the API you're looking at. And the API consists of some paths and some components. And components, there's lots of stuff that you can put in components. But the, yeah. Sorry about that. So you've got paths, which are, URL paths, URI paths, and components, which include a lot of stuff, like I was saying. But in particular, it can include schema descriptions, so request bodies and response bodies and things like that. And we'll look at some examples in a minute. And here are actually at the bottom of the screen here are 3 examples of APIs that exist in the public domain. The world is full of them, right? And quite a lot of them these days, especially if they're HTTP and JSON, have this OpenAPI metadata associated with them. And it just helps you to orient yourself and to consume the API, to find out about it, and to write clients for it and to document it and things like that. So, I mean, we could have a look at one of these. We could, I don't know if I just click on that, will it jump in there? Yes, it will. Okay, so there's a probably a familiar view to anybody who's used this stuff. This is the Wizard World API that somebody deployed. It's about Harry Potter, the domain of Harry Potter. So you've got the houses, you've got spells, ingredients, and you've got wizards. And here are the schemas. So that you've got inputs and outputs, basically. And this is the schema. Let's see, let's look at a wizard. A wizard has attributes like first name and last name, and also the elixirs that he knows about. So it's more or less a complete description of, you know, at least the technical side of the API. And you can add additional information. Lots of people do, lots of people don't, in fact. But you can add documentation, links and stuff like that in there. So I'm going to have to go up a couple of screens. It's got lost here. There we go. So I've been describing this already. So what is OpenAPI? It's a specification, relatively formal. And what it ends up being is a YAML or JSON representation of an HTTP API. There are lots of different aspects to the metadata, like available endpoints, and they call them operations. And the link at the bottom, I'd just like to highlight that, is a generator API, which is an actual Open API, an API exposed and described by OpenAPI, which generates clients for OpenAPI. So you give it your JSON and it will give you code in Java or Python or JavaScript or whatever you ask for. So that's kind of an interesting thing to do, but I don't really have time to demo it properly here today. We don't have time for that. So basically you get this useful JSON or YAML. They're sort of interchangeable. And you can do stuff with it. You can transform it into more useful things like what you've already seen. You saw the HTML UI, they call it Swagger UI, which can be used to interact with as well as document an API. And you can also use it to generate code. So that's what's being shown at the bottom here. So I'm generating a public class model. This is like a data holder. So this is going to be from the schema of the JSON on the left-hand side. I'm generating some Java code, which is a Java Bean representation of that schema object. Okay, so far so cool. So who is actually using it? Well, it turns out, like I said, it turns out a lot of people are using it. So we do this thing every year. We have this State of Spring survey. It's quite interesting. We get quite a good response. Thousands of people respond to it every year. And last year, we asked specifically some questions about how people are using APIs. And one of the reasons we did that was because we wanted to find out about GraphQL, because we just published our own library, Spring GraphQL, and we wanted to learn about whether people were using it, what they were using it for, that kind of thing. So we asked a bunch of questions about APIs and got some interesting answers. So as you can see, GraphQL improved its popularity or increased its usage last year. And around about a quarter of users of Spring have touched at least GraphQL. I don't know how to interpret the numbers. It's, you know, I would think of it as probably they use it, or you have used it, or they know someone who uses it. That's how I would answer the question anyway. But what's interesting for this conversation, for this presentation, is OpenAPI is not only is it growing, but it's over half of the people who responded to the survey, which are probably fairly representative of Spring users generally. 61% of them said they used OpenAPI. So that's pretty big, really, isn't it? That's why I assume that many of you listening here today will have actually already encountered it. So if Spring users are using OpenAPI, what are they doing actually? What sort of things are they doing, and what tools are they using? Because we, the Spring team, don't actually provide any features for OpenAPI per se, and yet it's obviously quite popular. So I mean, that is representative of the fact that the tools that are out there are actually very good. So there are a few tools in the community that are supported by the people who use them, and they're really good and they work really well with Spring. So we don't need to do much to get you to the to this level, at least anyway. 60% of you using it, but I'm always looking for, what might be the next interesting thing for us to do. So that's partly why I did this research. So here's some patterns that you see. So the first kind of split that you see is between two approaches: code first and API first. You either write your Java code first if you're using Spring, or you write your JSON or YAML first. And so if you write your code first, then you turn it into JSON. You can use that to generate your documentation. That's, I think, quite a common pattern. If you do it the other way, then you write your, it's not really a contract, but it feels a bit like a contract. You write your specification first, your JSON specification, and then you use that to generate server-side code. So, Spring in Webflux or Spring MVC. That's the example shown there. Or you can use it to generate clients in a variety of languages, and the tools that are out there are quite good at producing different flavor clients for different languages that people use on the front end. And so given that those two splits are quite common, I've come across a few examples where this was the case. So there's one team in particular at VMware, in fact. So I don't know if you knew this, but there's quite a lot of internal web service and HTTP API stuff inside vSphere. So, and other products that VMware produces. And so vCloud is one of those, which is very focused on OpenAPI. And I talked to that team, and they said they had started with API first. They did everything in JSON and generated code. And they got a bit frustrated with the way that was working out for them. And so they switched to this pattern where they write the server code first, generate JSON from that, and then they use that to generate documentation and client code, but they don't need it. They don't do the code first for the clients. They do it from the server. They generate the JSON and then the clients. So I thought that was interesting, and I think that they've been quite successful at that. And another thing that team and other teams that I've spoken to have said that they need to do is this. So a gateway is a very common pattern, right? So if you've got more than one HTTP API, you might have dozens or even hundreds. It's not uncommon. But you want to present them as like a single, or maybe two or three separate interfaces. So actually the team that I was talking to, this VMware vCloud team, they have a public facing gateway like thing. So a unified API for customers to use, like developers or operators, I suppose, because it's infrastructure, isn't it? And they also have an admin API that can only be used by administrators, and I think also probably an internal API that's only used by the components between themselves inside the system. And so they have dozens of YAML documents which are basically living inside their own respective servers, and they need to aggregate them in different ways and choose, some of the bits that are public facing, some of the bits which are admin facing, some of the bits which are totally internal, and just make 2 or 3 unified API specs and expose that through some sort of gateway. Gateway is a very common pattern, right? And Spring Cloud Gateway is one of the more successful Spring Cloud projects. So I found that quite interesting. And I'll come back to this because this, I found when I saw the pattern being used, I found that people had invented their own complicated automation for it, right? That is definitely a place where there is no existing tooling that I'm aware of. So that might be something that we can help them with. Okay, so the available tools for the patterns I just described, there's nothing for aggregation yet, but I'll get to that in a minute. So if you want to do schema generation, so API first, code first, schema generation. I'm going to show you, there are actually more tools than this available, but I'm going to show you the top 3, I guess, at least, if I've got time. So there's one called SmallRye, which probably isn't very widely used, but I found it interesting because it works at build time. So at build time, you can transform your Spring controllers into JSON. And that's quite a useful thing to do. Static analysis, basically. So it should be possible at build time. And then you've got Spring Docs, which is probably my favorite tool to use in this set here. And you can use that also to generate JSON or YAML, so generate the OpenAPI specs from your Spring code. And you can also use it to generate documentation. There are build plugins for both of those things, and also libraries that you kind of plug into the application. I'll show you those if I've got time in a demo. On the other side, so API first, there are a couple of things that I've seen people using. OpenAPI Generator is kind of the official community-driven project. It's very large. It's one big spaghetti mess of mustache templates for many, many languages. And so you can generate client code, server code, you can generate documentation, you can generate code in many different languages with many different options. You can do Spring Boot 2, you can do Spring Boot 3, you can do, whatever you want, basically. There's an option for it there. And so many people who do API first are using this OpenAPI generator toolset. The ones who don't, in the Spring world, in the Java community, are probably using something called Swagger Code Gen, which it's very similar, but mainly used for generating client code. I think it looks a lot like a fork of OpenAPI generator. It might not be officially, but it's very, very similar because it's the same kind of architecture. Okay, so I'm actually going to jump into a demo to show you that stuff before I come back to the aggregation. So aggregation is something that I've been thinking about in more detail since I first did this presentation, but I can do a quick demo first. How are we doing for time? Yeah, we've got time. So to save a bit of time, I have generated a brand new project here from start.spring.io. Everybody knows about that, right? Start.spring.io. This is a vanilla project with Spring Boot Starter Web, Spring Boot Starter Actuator. So nothing else. Except I have gone ahead and in the Spring Boot application, I've got a simple REST controller that serves JSON on an endpoint called /manual. And you can see what it does. It just returns a Java object model, which is going to be serialized to JSON. You know the picture, right? So I don't need to run this application and show you what it does because you basically know. So so we've got code first, right? We've written our server. what if we wanted to have a look at some JSON? Well, the simplest thing to do would be to use this small right thing. So I've got a little shortcut for that. Yes, I do want to do that. So here's the Maven plugin being added, and if I was just to run the build on the command line very quickly, you will see if you can see that section of my screen. Can I get rid of that? I can get rid of that. Okay. You should see the small right plugin has been run. And so I will find here in my target generated, I'll find some JSON. Okay. So there is pretty much all of the information that was in the Spring at rest controller, right? And if you want to, there's some Swagger specific annotations, OpenAPI annotations you could add to add more metadata, but this is basically all you need to know to operate the machine, right? Is the endpoint path I can call get, I can't call post on it, that hasn't been mapped. And when I do, I'm going to get an object of type model, and model is defined down here as a property called name of type string. All very simple. So what I'd like to do is turn that around again. So let's take that JSON and put it up here, and then just generate. So I'm going to see what I did there. I copied the manual one, and I opened it back up and called it generated. It's basically the same thing, and I'm going to see if I can generate an API. And I'm going to do that by, I can probably leave that small right one in there, but just to keep things simple, I'm going to add the OpenAPI plugin. Okay, so there's a lot of configuration there because I'm going to generate a server and a client, so I can show you that both of things happening at the same time. And here I'm going to add the OpenAPI dependencies. Okay, so I've added some null assertion annotations, some Jackson data format stuff, and some, that's it, some Jackson data format stuff. Okay, so those will be needed to compile the code which is generated by the plugin, and the plugin is going to be run, might even already have been run because the IDE might have done it already. Generated sources, and it hasn't done it yet. So I'm just going to run that on the command line again. Oops. Why doesn't it like me? Cannot invoke. Did I forget to add something? I've told it to use YAML, and I've been using JSON. That might work. There, that's better. So that was the generator generating code. There are some errors. Might be okay. We'll see. Anyway, it has generated some code. Just it doesn't think it can compile it yet. It should be fine, right? Have I got the wrong version of Java? I can't have because I'm using Spring Boot 3. No, Java 17. Okay, so I'm pretty sure that that's valid, even though it says that it can't compile it. It has generated another version of that model schema object. Okay, so now I've got two models in my source code. I've got the original one that I made here. I've got a generated one, which it's basically got the same properties in it, right? So this is for the client, And for the server side, I've got yet another version of the same object model. And let me show you what it's done. So what it's generated for me here is an interface. I asked it to do this. So I said there were lots of different options for the generator. I asked it to generate an interface with Spring MVC annotations on it. So the way this works then is that to implement this service, what I have to do is just provide an implementation of this interface. And so why that works well is because as the API evolves, the interface changes, and then the implementation fails to compile, and you can reconcile the two and fix it. So there's kind of a generated and a manual piece of the code, and they always stay separate. And so that always works well. And I think that probably works better than going the other way, which is why people prefer sometimes to do it this way. All right. So because I think it's the IDE that's unhappy, I don't think there's actually anything wrong with this code. But I'm going to give up on this demo now and switch back to the slides that I was showing you. So I was thinking about this aggregation problem. Okay, I was thinking about this aggregation problem. And so I thought, well, that is probably something we can help with, because there are Java APIs for these spec objects, the OpenAPI spec. And they're quite good and they're quite mature because they've been used to generate all of that, those tools that I was just showing you. So I thought, well, maybe we could provide something, at least experimentally, right? This is what we do with new Spring projects. We put them in a special GitHub organization, Spring projects, like experimental. So you can go ahead and try that if you want to. It's deployed also to Artifactory. So the Spring snapshot repository has builds every time there's a source change. There's a CI build that puts a snapshot there. So there are snapshots building. And it does a bunch of things, but actually it's pretty simple at the minute, at least anyway. So you can use it to do spec merging. And so if you've got more than one spec or even loads of specs, you can merge them together into a single JSON or YAML object, and then either just store it, right? You could print it out to the file system and use it somewhere else, or you could serve it up from an endpoint in your application in your gateway. So it's kind of a gateway application, although none of the code in the aggregator actually depends on being a gateway. It's just aggregating JSON, basically. Another side effect that kind of fell out of the existing libraries that it depends on is that you can use it to convert OpenAPI 2, so Swagger version 2, into OpenAPI version 3. It kind of just does that for you. You don't have to do anything. So if any of the backend systems is old and has a version 2 spec, it will be converted into a version 3 spec automatically. Because it's a Spring Boot or oriented project or base project, it's got the usual external configuration model for properties files and stuff. And there are some Java APIs that you can use to control the merging and refactoring of JSON. So I would like to just show you this quickly. Let's see, it's going to be here. So this is the GitHub repo, basically. So it's got a handful of source files, not very much. And one of them is called an aggregator, so that's going to do the thing that you want it to do. And another one is called aggregator specs. And aggregator specs is kind of a user input. So if I was to show you a demo, here in the tests for the project is an actual gateway application. which is just a Spring Boot application using Spring Cloud Gateway. And what it does is it aggregates those two of the APIs that I showed you right at the beginning. So the wizard one and another one that I didn't actually bring up the interface for, but this one is a public API that does public holidays. So if you want to know who's got bank holiday on Monday, you can, or if you're going to visit another country and you want to know if the banks are going to be open when you get there, you can use this API. So it's slightly more practical and useful than the Wizard World one, but it's a similar idea. Anyway, so what it's going to do is aggregate those two APIs and then serve them up as a gateway. So the gateway bit is possibly familiar to you, but if not, I'm doing it here in Java as opposed to, you could also do it in a properties, YAML configuration. I'm doing it here in Java just so it's all in one place. So I'm saying paths in the gateway starting with dates will go to the dates API, and the dates API has a prefix. They want everything to start with /API/v3. Well, I don't care about that, but I can do that for my users, right? So the gateway just says dates/something, and then it's going to prefix whatever it gets with API v3. And the wizards just gets passed straight through to the wizards, having stripped off the wizards prefix, because this part of the prefix belongs to the gateway, not the application, right? So there we go. They've got the gateway spec. That's simple and well-known and not new. The new thing is this. So this is, like I said, it's the user input for the aggregator is a spec. And there is a collection of specs, one for each of the backends that you want to aggregate. So the first one comes from dates, and its JSON is served up from this path. That's where it comes from on the server. And I'm saying I want to replace, so I've got some common operations that you want to do with when you're aggregating. So one of the commonest things you want to do is replace a path. So instead of /API/v3 at the beginning of every path, which you'll see in the dates API, I want it to say /dates, because that's what I'm presenting to my users. Okay, and then there's also this thing, I don't know if you noticed, but it was the same in the wizards. They like to have Java objects ending in DTO, and that's what all of their requests and responses are, something DTO, and that just irritated me. So I decided to replace all of those DTO objects with just truncating the last three letters. So wizard DTO is now wizard. All right. And that's it. Okay, everything else is done with Spring Boot auto configuration. So I can probably run that, and this should be safe. I can run that and show you what it looks like. Okay, it's a Spring Boot application. It's loading up. Oh, there's one last thing that I forgot to tell you about. In the application properties, I've told SpringDoc, remember that was the third-party tool that we're using to expose the JSON from our REST controllers. We're telling it that we want to see actuators. That's just a feature that SpringDoc has, and I've built that into the aggregator so that if you start with a SpringDoc actuator set, then you can just keep it. I thought that was kind of neat. So let me show you that. So that's running on localhost 8080 right now. So /v3 API docs will be the standard location. There you go. There's some JSON, and here I've got dates, a dates API, and let me just show you that in the Swagger API. So I've got a browser plugin here, which does So I just have to wait for it to load. The browser plugin is the Swagger UI. If you don't have the Swagger UI built into your application, you can just use the browser plugin. I wish it would not remember the previous URL, which is what it's doing. It's loading up something else. Okay, so the one from localhost looks like this. There you go. And now you can see actually that I've got all my actuators. So the actuators are listed as a separate group of endpoints. And then I've got countries, and I've got wizards and stuff to do with wizards. So there's the API exposed, and it all works. And it's done things like, it's kind of a refactoring operation, right? So when I changed the path from /v3 /API/v3/country info, I had to go around and make sure all of the links, there are internal links inside the spec. I had to make sure that those resolved correctly. Same thing with the schemas. When I took the DTO off the end of all the schema names, I had to go and resolve all the links and make sure that they refer to wizard instead of wizard DTO. So all of that happens inside the aggregator. And then you've got a sort of flexible thing inside this spec. So each spec is one of these, and you can basically, in addition to the simple examples I showed you already, you can just filter it. So you can say, given this spec, I want to transform it into another spec. So that's a function of OpenAPI spec to OpenAPI spec. I call that filter. So you can basically create arbitrary transformations of OpenAPI specs, and there are some special cases that are common, like transforming paths and transforming schemas. So that's a new thing, and if you want to try it out, that would be great. I would be super delighted to get some feedback on that. So for the last 5 minutes or so, I thought what I could do is show you something else that comes from VMware, is associated, in fact, with the Spring team and has an OpenAPI flavor. So it's not true that we're doing nothing in this space, and it's not true that we have no expertise. We're just getting started, I think. It's probably a good way to summarize that. So what I've got is I've got a Tanzu application platform instance, which is just Kubernetes. You can think of it as just Kubernetes, but it's Kubernetes with a bunch of stuff in it. And I have got myself an instance of that from this thing called Tanzu Academy, which you can do as well. You just need to sign on here and get yourself an account. And then if you click this button here, Start the Lab, it will create an instance of Tanzu application platform for you. And so I did that earlier on, and I've got my Kubernetes server running, so I could kubectl get pods. I could show you what's running. So there is right now, there is a gateway running, which is the thing that I just showed you. And there is an OpenAPI demo, actually doesn't seem to be running at the minute. Because anyway, so I can show you the what it looks like in the server. So this is like the Kubernetes command line view, just to prove that it is Kubernetes. But there is also this thing that we call the TAC GUI, so the Tanzu application platform GUI, which is basically Backstage. It's Backstage from Spotify, which is a kind of a tool for organizing developer workflows on Kubernetes, basically. And so you can see I've got these two workloads deployed in the Tanzu application platform. And if I looked at that, you would see how it got deployed through a pipeline, a supply chain. But what I'm here to show you is this. So the workload that I defined for the gateway told the platform that it wanted to be an API. It was an API, and it had its own OpenAPI spec built into it. And so you can see here it has a component list of components and some of them are of type OpenAPI, and 2 of them are, because the only 2 that I deployed are actually. So, and then if I looked at that, this is kind of backstage. This is how it works. You get lots of metadata about the apps that are running. You can see the relationships between them, that kind of thing. But the other thing you can do is you can see the OpenAPI spec and interact with it in the same way that you would with that browser plugin. I mean, once you know about this, you can then use whatever tools you have to interact with it. But it's kind of neat that the platform has an API. It's not really an aggregator, it's more of a sort of library, but it just sort of exposes all of the APIs in one place. There's actually a feature that I won't show you today because I don't have time, but there's also a thing called Spring Cloud Gateway for Kubernetes, which it's part of Tanzu application platform. So what you can do with that is you can basically do what I did with the aggregator, but it'll do it for you. So you just say, I want these 2 APIs to be behind a gateway, and everything else happens by magic. So it exposes aggregated OpenAPI specs for you. And a lot of the ideas that I got for the Java project there that I just showed you actually came from the team that did that work. So I guess I'm running out of time, right? I've got like 1 minute, so maybe I can just give you the links to all the information that you might want later. That's all I've got time for. Do I have? Okay. 5 minutes isn't enough to show the Spring Cloud Kubernetes, so gateway for Kubernetes. So I'll just leave it there. So we've got what did we talk about today? We talked about what is OpenAPI, how do people use it, how do they use it with Spring, and given the limitations that Spring doesn't provide any OpenAPI tools or libraries itself yet, people seem to be doing a pretty good job of that. So you can, for instance, use this small right thing. I showed you that because it generates API specs at build time. And the other one I showed, Spring Doc, I forgot to explain, but it doesn't do that. It does it at runtime. So if you want to get a copy of the JSON, you have to run the application and download it from the app. I mean, they have a plugin that does that, so it's sort of, you can automate it, sure, but it's a slightly different approach.